All right, this will be my second reading from Spinoza, Contra, Phenomenology by Knox Payton. It is about Deleuze and Heidegger. This will be part 2 of the chapter. It's chapter 6, which is entitled Toward a Science of the Singular, Gilles Deleuze, between Heidegger and Spinoza. So the section is called Ubesk Heidegger. And Ubesk Heidegger, I don't know how to pronounce that, Ubuesque, Heidegger. We'll just go ahead and start. In 1996, Agamben described Deleuze's commitment to, quote, liquidating the values of consciousness, end quote, in the following terms. Quote, Deleuze carries out of the gesture of a philosopher who, despite Deleuze's lack of fondness for him, is certainly closer to Deleuze than any other representative of phenomenology in the 20th century. Heidegger, the pataphysical Heidegger of the wonderful article of Alfred Jarry, the Heidegger whom Deleuze, through the incomparable Ubesk caricature, can finally recognize himself, end quote. Agamben is referring to one of Deleuze's very last writings, a short piece titled An Unrecognized Precursor to Heidegger, Alfred Jarry. Deleuze contends that the French absurdist conception of pataphysics as standing in the same relation to metaphysics as the latter does to physics is an adumbration of Heidegger's project. Promising to take us beyond metaphysics, pataphysics will give us the science of the singular, the contingent, or the particular. In a similar vein, Badiou identified the real question for Deleuze as being, quote, that of singularity, where and how does the singular meet up with the concept, end quote. Omitting references to Jarry, Badiou nonetheless also recognized Deleuze's critical relation to Heidegger on this subject. Though Agamben treats Deleuze's Ubesk caricature of Heidegger as a late development, the unlikely comparison appears to have been part of Deleuze's thinking for a long time. In the late 1940s, Deleuze attended Jean Beaufort's courses on Heidegger as the Lycée Henri IV, at the Lycée Henri IV, where it was impressed upon the students that the only way they would ever understand Heidegger was if they thought in German themselves. Deleuze would have none of it, suggesting that the French Jarry did not only understood Heidegger's thought, but anticipated it. Deleuze took this impudent comparison public in a review of Kostas Axelos' Vers on Pensée Planétaire, first published in 1964, bearing the title, quote, Be Creating Pataphysics, Jarry opened the way for phenomenology. By creating pataphysics, Jarry opened the way for phenomenology, end quote. Deleuze cited Jarry himself to justify the claim, quote, Pataphysics must be defined. An epiphenomenon is what is added on to a phenomenon. Pataphysics is the science of what is added onto metaphysics, whether in it or out of it, extending as far beyond metaphysics as metaphysics extends beyond physics. E.g., the epiphenomenon often being the accident, pataphysics will be above all the science of the particular, even though it is said that the science only deals with the general. Let us be clear for the specialist. Being is the epiphenomenon of all beings, which must be thought by the new thinker who is an epiphenomenon of man, end quote. Though he intends to capture, in a sardonic sense to be sure, the nature of Heidegger's project and the attempted synthesis of Heidegger and Marx being undertaken by Axelos, there are in fact few other passages in Deleuze's corpus that describe his own efforts as well as Jarry's definition does. Deleuze's attitude to phenomenology was thus by no means wholly derisive. He was impressed by the method, but not by its objects, which all too often amounted to generic structures of cognition, being, or comportment, rather than discrete singularities or events. For Deleuze, humor had a serious philosophical purpose. Years later, Deleuze described Foucault's relation to Heidegger in terms similar to his own. Quote, It is not a question of taking away Heidegger's seriousness, but of rediscovering the imperturbable seriousness of Rousseau or Jarry. Ontological seriousness needs a diabolical or phenomenological humor. Deleuze's diabolical engagement with serious ontology had early roots. His very first publication in 1945 was a pastiche of Sartrean existentialism titled Descriptions of Women for a Philosophy of the Sexed Other. The text pursues a critique of the Sartrean model of love to be found in being and nothingness, a model in which love is not only unsexed, but also decidedly not concrete, a battle over the possession of souls instead of an encounter between bodies. Deleuze offers an engagement with the concrete that evolves into a disquisition on the intercalated relation between interiority and exteriority. So what makes it diabolical, if not necessarily humorous? The article is primarily about women's cosmetics. Makeup is the formation of women's interiority. Sometimes the exterior is internalized. The black mascara that surrounds the eye ensconces the look and renders it internal to itself. Sometimes the internal is externalized while retaining beyond its externalization its internal being. Reddened lips are the opening out of the thick interiority. From here, Deleuze moves out to the fingernails, eyebrows, and even addresses the, quote, mysterious and perfect élan of freckles, end quote. Deleuze's Sartrean moment, if it can be even called that, was fleeting. Much more extensive was his consideration of Heidegger. The strongest evidence that Deleuze took Heidegger more seriously than his flippant allusions suggests it to be found in the surviving notes for a course taught in 1956-57 school year at the Lycée Louis Le Grand in Paris, bearing the name What is Grounding? An extensive interrogation of the problem of commencement in philosophy, that is, how one begins to think philosophically, and concurrently a historical exploration of the principle of sufficient reason. The course bears the traces of a very evident textual inspiration. Henri Corbin's translation and presentation of Heidegger in the collection titled Que est si qua la métaphysique. Scholars have recognized the important function of this volume, first published in 1938, in shaping the reception of Heidegger in France. In addition to the full translation of Heidegger's inaugural Freiburg lecture, What is Metaphysique, and excerpts from Division 2 of Being in Time, Corbin's volume contained a complete translation of the essay Vom Wesen des Grundes, The Essence of Ground, translated into French as Ce qui fait l'estrait essentiel d'un fondement ou raison, and the fourth and final section of Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics. These latter two texts especially were clearly significant for Deleuze's course and his own thinking on the problem of grounding, or fondement, as would become manifest in difference and repetition in the next decade. As Christian Karleski rightly remarks, quote, the discussion of Heidegger in What is Grounding have no equivalent elsewhere in Deleuze's writings. Karleski identifies the following key passage. Quote, with Heidegger, the transcendental becomes a structure of empirical subjectivity. Itself, the transcendental is reduced to transcendence, to going beyond. Perhaps in that case, transcendental subjectivity might seem to lose its importance. With Kant, it made knowledge possible because it submitted sensible objects to human knowledge. But the transcendental subject is what makes transcendence possible by submitting phenomena to its very operation of transcending. The transcendental subject ends up being simply that to which transcendence itself is immanent. With Heidegger, on the contrary, the distinction between transcendence and transcendental finally disappears. With him, they are identified to the point that one can no longer distinguish that which grounds from that which is grounded, which is why the root of every grounding is freedom, end quote. Heidegger, no less than Kant before him, identifies human freedom with transcendence. But the putative superiority of Heidegger's account is to make transcendence itself a component of lived experience, an instance that is temporal in its essence, grounding and being grounded at once. Kant had sought to develop an account of freedom reconcilable with the world of Newtonian necessity, but he accomplished this at a cost, making freedom unknowable by locating it in the nominal sphere. In his persistent attention to the Kant-Heidegger relation throughout his course, Deleuze depends not only on the contents of Corbin's volume, but also on Corbin's own editorial presentation of the texts. As Ethan Kleinberg has noted, certain of Corbin's translation decisions helped contribute to the initial anthropocentric account of Heidegger's thought that informed the earliest readings in France. Rendering Dasein as relate human sapped Heidegger's concept of much of its spatial connotation, though Heidegger approved the translation himself. Likewise, the notion of a reality unique to the human subject helped contribute to a perceived consonance between Heideggerian Dasein and the Cartesian cogito in France. Stefanos Gourlianos' emphasis on the suitability of the relate humain is an expression that named the essential vacuity of that reality, effectively serving as a conceptual placeholder for other determinate processes, helping us understand how the ego cogito, too, could increasingly become a vacuous placeholder in a variety of projects. Evincing a disregard for questions of subjectivity, Deleuze nonetheless participates in the reception of Heidegger, elaborated in Gourlianos' account, deploying the German philosopher not as a celebrant of existential angst, but as a conceptual way station to a more primordial ontology. Following Corbin, Deleuze expresses the need to reconceive the Kantian problem of transcendental conditions in terms of structures of existence indifferent to any presupposed categories of human subjectivity. Deleuze's own revisionist attitude to Heideggerian ontology against any nominally humanist reading is adumbrated in Corbin's avant-propos to the collection. First, Corbin observes with regard to the study of Kant, quote, as a repetition of Kant's question, the research releases the idea of a metaphysics of relation humain in a way that shows the worthlessness of the occasional charges of anthropologism or anthropocentrism thoughtlessly leveled at Heidegger, end quote. Significantly, the emphasis on repetition in this passage is Corbin's. More important still is the way Corbin's assessment reads Heidegger's repetition of Kant's question as geared towards producing something different from Kant's answer, though still conditioned by it. In other words, difference results from repetition, or as Deleuze will argue, repetition is the temporal form that difference takes. Finally, there is Corbin's gloss on Heidegger's ecstasis. Quote, existence is ecstatic, the triple ecstasis of time's temporality is the very structure of its transcendence, end quote. A major portion of difference and repetition will be developed precisely to an account of what Deleuze terms the three syntheses of time. The first synthesis is that of habit, the living present of passive experience. The second synthesis is that grounded in memory. It is the instance each present is merely the most contracted moment of a virtual past. The third synthesis is what Deleuze terms, quote, the pure and empty form of time, end quote. It is the site of Nietzsche's eternal return, the abyss that grounds time as lived present and as retained past while keeping it open to the future. The eternal return as the pure and empty form of time is what makes possible a gesture that inscribes itself in a future created by the gesture itself. These themes will be fleshed out in the next chapter when we return to the concepts of difference and repetition, but the most urgent issue for the moment is simply to highlight the importance of Heidegger for this component of Deleuze's thought. To be sure, Nietzsche is Deleuze's major reference, and Kierkegaard is given a significant amount of attention as well. But each of these engagements is mediated through Heidegger's problematic. In this sense, Deleuze's project is as much a result of the arrival of Heidegger in France as his thinkers covered in Kleiberg's account of the, quote, generation existential, end quote, and Gourlianos' assessment of French anti-humanism. Rather than being indebted to those thinkers most often associated with the first reading of Heidegger, chiefly Sartre and Kojève, for whom the problematic of subjectivity, if not humanism, was the primary concern, Deleuze has much more in common with the readings pursued by Emmanuel Levinas and Marcel Blanchot. Though Levinas is conspicuously absent from virtually all of Deleuze's work, Blanchot is a guiding reference whenever Deleuze considers the relationship between death and possibility. The common link between Levinas, Blanchot, and Deleuze is an emphasis on the structural components of time as entailing an inescapable opening toward a future. The signal difference between Levinas and Deleuze on this score would be that whereas Levinas reads this structure as an ontological condition to which one passively submits, for Deleuze, the opening to the future is always the result of creative forces that are in excess of their subjective representation. A short detour through one of Deleuze's richest texts will help make this contrast clearer. In one of his early writings, Time and the Other, Levinas laid the groundwork for his later reversal of Heidegger's concept of Dasein's authentic appropriation of time by emphasizing the opening toward otherness as an intrinsic feature of time itself. The openness toward otherness was a result of the fact that the infinite was ontologically anterior to the finite, providing the basic structures of finite existence as grounded in a constitutive openness. In 1967, Deleuze published an article in Critique, quote, Michel Tournier and the World Without Others, end quote, devoted to Tournier's retelling of Robinson Crusoe in the novel Vendredi ou Les Limbes dans le Pacifique. Deleuze's assessment, which references Sartre but makes no explicit mention of Levinas, despite its evocation of the positions of time and the other, maintains the otherness is a structural and ontological condition of existence, but that in the end it is a second-order one. Tournier's fiction complicates Levinasian ontology by showing that beneath the phenomenon of structured otherness, a phenomenon as endemic to existence as the effects of representation, there is a more fundamental, quote, world without others, end quote, generating these effects. The core of Deleuze's perversion of Levinas, and it is fitting that Deleuze's account of Tournier's Robinson begins with a discussion of perversion, is a kind of flattening or spatialization of Levinas's account of temporality into a world devoid of distinction and the discrete. The quote-unquote world without others is a structural impossibility for Levinas, since one could never occupy a temporal existence that is not constitutively open to the otherness inherent in temporal unfolding. But Deleuze insists upon the value of Tournier's fiction, which, by taking place on a desert island completely removed from the world, provides the lineaments of an existence lacking the other structure of the perceptive field, allowing us to penetrate into a particular informal realm. Deleuze readily admits that Tournier has given us a necessary fiction. He cites and endorses William James's contention that a priori otherness is, quote, the oxygen of possibility, end quote. Nonetheless, Tournier's fiction is necessary in two senses. It is necessarily fictional in that it could never take place in the world of lived experience. But it is also fiction that serves as the only viable base of the rationalist philosophy, in that it presents a world in which precisely there is no longer the human artifact of possibility, a world that Deleuze significantly describes as one lacking the, quote, laws which structure the order of the real in general and the succession of time, end quote. He concludes his account ambiguously, block quote, the world of the pervert is a world without others, and thus a world without the possible. The other is that which renders possible. The other is that which renders possible. The perverse world is a world in which the category of the necessary has completely replaced that of the possible, a strange Spinozism where the oxygen lacks to the benefit of a more elementary energy and a rarefied air, sky necessity, end quote. This detour through Deleuze's reading of Tournier has served to illustrate 2 points. First, it shows the extent to which Deleuze's own engagements were conditioned by Heidegger, mediated through Corbin's reading, along with Sartre's, Levinas, and Blanchot's. But it also shows how these problems dovetail with Deleuze's engagement with Spinozism, positing the latter as the philosophy best suited to the ontological field that Deleuze believes is anterior to the one described in Heideggerian philosophy. What is most striking about this conclusion is the way that Deleuze imbues Spinozism, however strange, with an ethical ambiguity. Who could breathe this rarefied air? Deleuze does not will or call for a world without others, even as he indirectly questions the philosophical utility of a project that posits the existential phenomena of otherness and lived temporality as its primary concerns. One final key text from the earliest years of Deleuze's career shows the centrality of this critical motive to his effort. His review of Jean Hyppolite's account of Hegel's logic and existence. Deleuze assents to most of Hyppolite's reading, especially its critique of the primacy accorded to subjectivity in Kojelev's influential account. For his part, Hyppolite, Hyppolite, sought to return the focus to the account of substance in Hegel's philosophy, arguing that contradiction was an intrinsic component of existence and that the contradiction constitutive of subjectivity was merely an epiphenomenon of this more foundational movement. Nonetheless, Deleuze concludes his review by questioning whether Hyppolite's positing of contradiction as the pinnacle of difference taken to its limit, is itself not reflective of an anthropocentric bias in Hyppolite's Hegel. Deleuze asks, quote, "Can we not make an ontology of difference that does not go all the way to contradiction, because contradiction would be less than difference and not more," end quote. Deleuze's question then take a more pointed cast, quote, "It is the same thing to say that being expresses itself and that it contradicts itself," end quote. Does Hyppolite not ground a theory of expression wherein difference is expression itself and contradiction is only its phenomenal aspect? The title of Deleuze's thesis on Spinoza was Composition Base, begun in the years following the publication of this review in 1954, is Spinoza and the Problem of Expression. It is thus via a return to Spinoza that Deleuze seeks a non-anthropocentric and non-phenomenal account of difference as expression itself. In his critique of Deleuze's thought, Badiou suggests that Deleuze's ambivalent relationship to Heidegger's philosophy is a result of his recognition that Heidegger had gone only halfway in his account of ontological difference, limiting it to the intentional structure of the human experience of the world that had been its own point of departure. What Deleuze shared with Heidegger was the concern to show that that which grounds and that which is grounded must be considered in their inseparability as a fundamental structure of existence. But Heidegger's shortcoming was similar to that of Hyppolite's Hegel. In seeking to move beyond Kant, Heidegger accepted as unimpeachable certain elements of nominally intrinsic to human experience, most important, the thematic of finitude. When Deleuze says that Alfred Jarry has anticipated Heidegger with pataphysics, there is no doubt that his tongue is firmly in cheek. But the point remains a serious one. In effect, Deleuze mobilizes Jarry's absurdist example to promote his own rationalist project, which aims to be a philosophy not of generic forms or structures, but of singular instances or events. The apparent tendencies towards irrationalism in Heidegger's project are to be recaptured as tendencies toward an even more foundational rationalism, subtending the irrationality of existence. All right, that ends that portion of this chapter. Next one is titled A Post-Kantian Spinoza. It is about 5 or 6 pages. That actually will end the chapter here. Thanks for listening.